Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the second in our four-part lecture series of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. What makes us different and what makes us the same. We had a very successful first lecture last week where we had Professor Ira Robinson, who happens to be honoring us with his presence again tonight, where there was a bit of a definition of historical movements of the Jewish people and in the context of the greater world politics and world religions at the times. So he took us to the early and late Middle Ages, where the world was divided primarily into Christian countries and Muslim countries, and the Jews in each of these parts of the world were extremely influenced by their neighbors and the languages they spoke, etc. Tonight I have the honor of presenting to you, of introducing Dr. Andrea Gondos, who will be starting in the Middle Ages and speaking about philosophy and Kabbalah in the Middle Ages. And I would like to say that I've been a friend of Andrea and Chaba for several years. We met, in fact, through Rabbi Joseph at the Spanish and Portuguese, where we had a lot of lively discussions on many Jewish topics. And now, as of 2013, Dr. Gondos is Dr. Gondos. She finished her doctoral dissertation.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. And she wrote extensively about the Kabbalah in print in the Middle Ages. Through into early modernity, the effects of the printing of the Kabbalah on its popularization in primarily in Central and Eastern Europe. In 2011, she co-edited a book entitled From Antiquity to the Postmodern World, Contemporary Jewish Studies in Canada. And currently she's an adjunct scholar at the Katz Center of Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. So she's quite busy. Recently she was awarded the Azrieli Postdoctoral Fellowship for the coming academic year, 2014, and that will be in Tel Aviv in Israel. Wow. So with great pleasure, please enjoy Dr. Andrea Gondos. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone for coming. And first and foremost, thank you to Rabbi Steinmetz. Thank you to Michelle Kale and the Adult Education Committee for making this particular lecture series possible and for inviting me to speak tonight. Now, we have a fairly large topic tonight, and I'd like to jump right into it immediately. But before I do that, I do have to say a proviso. Again, this is a very large topic, so we're not going to be able to cover every single aspect of it. And because, as we heard from Professor Robinson last week, philosophy was the mainstay of Muslim lands. So philosophy amongst Jews were cultivated in areas where they lived under Muslim rule, which included in the Middle Ages at this time primarily the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain, as well as northern part of North Africa, and going into and toward the east, Babylonia and the Byzantine Empire. So at this time, philosophy was not a prevalent and was not a strong cultural force in Ashkenaz. Therefore, I'm not going to spend too much time on talking about philosophy in Ashkenaz. However, we will touch on Kabbalah in Ashkenaz, a little bit on Hasidei Ashkenaz, prevalent in the Rhineland communities, German Hasidism. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Again, I don't have time to spend too much on the Rhineland Jews. Again, that would be a topic in and of itself, but we will touch upon it so that you will get a sense of some of the similarities and differences between Kabbalah in the Iberian Peninsula and Kabbalah as it was studied and transmitted in Hasidei Ashkenaz. So with the proviso, let me jump right into our topic. The philosophical views of the medieval Jewish philosophers entered Judaism via contact between Jews and other cultures. From the early 10th century through the late 12th centuries, first and foremost contact with Islamic civilization in Spain, and from the 12th the residue of a cold. The 12th, through the 16th centuries, through contact with Christian culture in Christian Spain, Provence, and Italy. Following their extended conquest, beginning with the 7th century, the Muslims began translating the works of Greek philosophy, composed commentaries on them, and developed their own philosophical, theological systems with categories and principles that originated with the Greeks, principally Aristotle and Plato. Jews familiar with Islamic thought admired and appropriated many categories and principles. Although the medieval Jewish philosophers understood both the Bible and the rabbinic corpus as a repository of philosophical and scientific truths, they realized that only through new interpretation and radical restructuring of the content of these texts will they be able to expose their internal theological verity and relevance. In order to do this, a major methodological shift had to be adopted by Jewish philosophers. Thus, unlike rabbinic midrash and Talmudic tractates, which deployed allusions, word associations, and analogies to construct religious meaning, the medieval philosopher reconfigured the classical text of Judaism by using logic, categories of rational inquiry to explain religious ideas and concepts in these particular texts. One of the very interesting mainstay of medieval society, and this is true both in northern Spain, which was under Christian rule, as well as in southern Spain, which was more under Muslim rule, was that Jews were forced to come into contact with different ideational systems. So again, as I mentioned, philosophy is transmitted primarily through Arabic thinkers, through Arabic theologians, and in the language, as Professor Robinson mentioned, of Arabic. So if you did not live under Arabic rule, under Muslim rule, if you lived in the northern part of Spain or in France or in Germany, and you were not exposed therefore to Arabic, and you did not learn Arabic, this type of literature, the philosophical literature, was not open to you. So you were not able to access the philosophical literature at this time. It's not until later on in the 13th century, in the 12th, 13th centuries, when gradually the philosophical works of these Arab philosophers and theologians begin to be translated by Ibn Tibbon, for example, who was one of the major translators from Arabic to Hebrew. And through these translations, these texts, these philosophical texts, are starting to make their way north, first to northern Spain, and then later on through France and Provence and France, and over to Italy. So it's very important to keep in mind that Jewish communities that were in the northern part of Europe were not exposed, they did not know Arabic, and they were not exposed to this type of literature at this time. So, for example, when we look at the circle of Rashi and the Tosafists, they write in Hebrew, and their primary preoccupation is Talmud and writing commentaries to the Bible and commentaries to the Talmud. On the other hand, if we go down toward the south, if we go to southern Spain, to Andalusia, to the southern part of Spain, which was completely in the political, cultural orbit of the Muslim rulers, there we see that Nachmanides, Ibn Ezra, Maimonides are exposed to this vast literature that is being poured forth from the writings of Arabic authors. And so what ends up happening is that these theologians, these Jewish theologians and thinkers have to contend with this literature, and they have to synchronize and bring into dialogue the traditional texts of Judaism, the Bible, the Talmudic corpus, and the Midrashim and other rabbinic texts in dialogue with this philosophical literature. And this is sometimes smooth and sometimes not so smooth. And there's certain benefits to it, intellectual benefits, and we'll discuss what these are, but there are also grave dangers with introducing an exogenous, a foreign system, that is philosophy, into understanding traditional, classical Jewish texts, such as the Bible and the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrashim. So there's things to be gained, but there are also great danger, and there's a reason why, in fact, Maimonides' more philosophically inclined work, The Guide of the Perplexed, in fact gets burnt by the cardinal, by the Christian cardinal in Montpellier in 1232 in a bonfire. So I will touch a little bit about that, why this happened, but very soon after Maimonides writes his works, the Mishneh Torah and the Guide of the Perplexed, there's reaction to this, especially coming from the Christian milieu, Jews living in the Christian milieu, halachists, jurists, rabbis, who do not agree with his methods and who see the Jews in their communities who get emboldened to leave behind certain traditional precepts of Judaism, who are emboldened to look at the commandments, for example, the mitzvot, in an allegorical way, which of course Maimonides espouses, to look at the Torah, to look at rabbinic literature in an allegorical way, and to say, well, I'm not going to follow the commandments, I can just allegorically, I can understand allegorically the prohibition against eating meat and milk together. So the allegorical understanding of the Bible, once you apply that kind of approach to understanding other aspects of Judaism, such as the mitzvot, will have great dangers. And the rabbis understood this, and they saw the dangers in their own communities of people who could not properly consume the works of Maimonides, which we do have to mention were written for the elites. Maimonides wrote to the elites and for the elites. And so those segments of the Jewish communities who were not learned in philosophy, who were not learned in Talmud, whose preoccupation was not study every day and all day long, they selectively incorporated certain aspects of the Maimonidean corpus and said, well, oh, he tells us that we can look at the Bible and therefore we can look at the commandments allegorically. I will follow that in my life. And so the rabbis in these communities react to this, and they bring it to the attention of the Cardinal of Montpellier, and the Cardinal of Montpellier investigates the case, investigates the Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, and ends up burning it, as I mentioned, in Montpellier in 1232. But back to our story. So thus, when Maimonides undertakes to represent the Talmud in a more systematic and therefore more accessible manner in his Mishneh Torah, one of the first literary elements that he dispenses with when he writes the Mishneh Torah is rabbinic Agadah, which formed an integral part of the narrative structure of the Talmud. His compression of the Talmudic tractates into 14 topically ordered segments and tractates brought awe and reserved rejection. In many communities, especially in the Sephardic orbit, the Mishneh Torah became the standard halachic guide in yeshivot. On the other hand, other rabbinic leaders were troubled by its uniformity and regulated too narrowly every aspect of Jewish life. In Ashkenazi communities especially, local variants, minhagei hamakom, so the local custom of a particular community in the Ashkenazic geographical milieu, constituted important factors in the decision-making process of local halachists and rabbinic jurists. Rabbi Abraham ben David of Poskier, or the Rabbad of Poskier, who himself was a luminous figure and rabbinic authority and wrote a very important commentary on the Talmud. He lived in Provence. voices his objection to Maimonides' halakhic method in the Mishneh Torah, and he says the following, and you have that on your handout as number 1. I say, he says, he, that is Maimonides, wanted to bring order, but he did not succeed because he departed from the method of all students of the law who came before him, in that they brought proof of their teachings, and in that they set out the law in the name of its propounder. So there are 2 aspects by which Rabat criticizes Moses Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. That is, he does not bring proof from the Talmud. So when he makes a decision on a particular question in halakha, he does not bring a proof text from the Talmud to support his argument. And the second contention that he has with the Mishneh Torah is that he does not lay down the name of the Tana or the Amorah in whose name that particular law was introduced in the Talmud. So these 2 aspects he finds objectionable in Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. He continues, now, I have no way of knowing whether I should reverse my legal traditions and opinions because of the nature of the work of this author, Maimonides. If the one who disagrees with me is greater than I, then all is well. If not, why should I withdraw my opinion for this? In other words, what Rabat is saying, I don't think that this Maimonides that everybody's praising is greater than I am. Therefore, if in my eyes he's not greater than I am, he's not a greater jurist, he's not more learned, if I do not have kavod for him, then I am not forced and I should not change my halakhic, the way I bring halakhic decisions, and I should not follow his Mishneh Torah. Therefore, that code, the Mishneh Torah that Maimonides puts forward is not a code to be followed by me, and I will follow my own way of arriving at halakhic decisions. Further, there are matters in which, he continues, further there are matters in which the Geonim disagree. This author, Maimonides, arbitrarily chose one opinion and set it down. Why should I depend on his choice if it does not find favor with me? This is nothing but a presumptuous project. So Rabat does not hide his opinion. He thinks Maimonides' work, the Mishneh Torah, is presumptuous. It has great methodological flaws. He does not follow the kind of argumentation. Maimonides abandons the kind of flexibility that the Talmud allows in the categories of halakha. In the Talmud is not a code. The Talmud, when it talks about questions of law, of halakha, it does it discursively, which means it gives you different opinions. There are different sages who propose one particular opinion, and right on the same page you have another sage who proposes often a contradictory opinion. But what that does is it creates an interesting dialectic process in the Talmud, so that when later halachists come and they look at the Talmud, they are able to find variegated and different possibilities to go by. So it gives halakhic flexibility to the rabbinic jurist, which he can apply to the particular situation that is brought before him when he makes the decision. When Maimonides wrote his code using sort of the systematic principles of philosophy always tries to present ideas in a systematic, logical manner. And that is why Maimonides writes the Mishneh Torah, in order to bring some kind of order in the messiness of the Talmud. He says because of the expulsions that we are experiencing, we don't have the time to study as much as we were able to study before. Halakhic jurists do not have the time to pore over the volumes of Talmud and to figure out the nuances of halakha. Therefore, this code will make halakha and legal decision making more accessible to our times and introduces some kind of rational, systematic organization in the messiness of the Talmud. But what that does, it becomes counterproductive because it arrests this kind of flexibility. It puts a stop to the kind of flexibility that was part and parcel of the Talmud, which the Rabbah says he wants to continue in his own halachic enterprise, which was, as I mentioned, a very important factor in the Ashkenazi manner of halakha, where the customs of a particular place was as important as certain other aspects of halakha. Moving on to the Guide of the Perplexed of Maimonides. Again, it's a very large work. And in the Guide of the Perplexed, he is moving away from halakha. He tries to tackle some of the difficulties that he finds in the biblical text. So he says that there are many difficult parables, many difficult ideas and concepts in the Bible. He says in the prophets, he calls the entire Bible as a prophetic work. So he says there are many difficult parables, contradictory ideas in Tanakh, and he would like to elucidate these contradictory ideas in a more rational fashion. And with that, he writes the Guide of the Perplexed. In this, Maimonides gives a philosophical interpretation to the obscure parables occurring in the books of the prophets, but which are not explicitly identified there as such. Maimonides argues that if the reader is not instructed regarding the proper understanding of these notions, they might be easily led into confusion, error, and even religious heresy. Therefore, he proposes to elucidate his readers by differentiating between the literal, or the peshat, and the hidden meaning of Scripture. By establishing that the Bible has multiple layers, he's able to mitigate the raw, anthropomorphic, and sometimes absurd elements in the literal meaning of Tanakh and rabbinic texts, and propose a kind of demythologized, rational meaning to them. And he says, but if we explain these parables to him, to the reader, or if we draw his attention to their being parables, he will take the right road and be delivered from perplexity, and hence the title, Guide of the Perplexed. And one of the things that Maimonides takes real difference with in the biblical account is the anthropomorphic imagery associated with sometimes describing a God. So when the Bible says the ear of God, the eye of God, that God has changed and has been angered, that God can feel emotions, that God can be angered and changes his mind, that God descended, went down. What do these mean? Can God really function like human beings, like we do, that God has eyes as we do, or we have the rabbinic Agadah where God puts on phylacteries? Can God put on phylacteries? What is this? Maimonides said, we need to understand these kinds of images, these anthropomorphic images that the Bible and rabbinic literature allude to in new ways. So they need to be represented and understood in a new way. And his solution to this new way is to propose that many of these images are allegories. They stand sometimes for different things, different concepts. So for example, let me give you an example here from the Guide of the Perplexed. He's looking at Proverbs 7:6-21. So he's looking at Proverbs, and he recasts this story in Proverbs in a very different way that accords with his philosophical propensities. He says the following. An example of the second kind of, you don't have this on your sheets. An example of the second kind of prophetic parable is the following text, Proverbs. For at the window of my house I looked forth through my lattice, and I beheld among the thoughtless ones, I discerned among the youths, a young man void of understanding passing through the street near her corner, and he went the way to her house. In the twilight, in the evening of the day, in the blackness of night and the darkness, and behold, there met him a woman, with the attire of a harlot, and wily of heart. She is riotous and rebellious. She caught him, and so on. Sacrifices of peace offering were due from me, and so on. Therefore came I forth to meet thee. I have decked with coverlets. I have perfumed my bed. Come, let us take our fill of love. He is now going on to Shir HaShirim. My husband is not at home, and so on. The bag of money. With her much fair speech, she causes him to yield. With the blandishment of her lips, she entices him away. The outcome of all this, says Maimonides, is a warning against the pursuit of bodily pleasures and desires. Accordingly, he, Solomon, the purport author of Proverbs, likens the matter, which is the cause of all these bodily pleasures, to a harlot, who is also a married woman. So the harlot in this particular section of the Proverbs stands in for bodily pleasures, and of course Maimonides and philosophers usually advocate a kind of aesthetic lifestyle. One of the ways that philosophers conceptualize the perfect human being, the perfect philosopher, is by cultivating perfection through by rejecting some of the bodily desires and cultivating more the spiritual faculties of human beings. So this goes very well with Maimonides' idea that that Proverbs here in particular is talking about a warning. It's an allegory, it's an allegorical understanding of talking about the pursuit of bodily pleasures, and it's admonishing the Jew not to go after them. Okay. Another very interesting aspect that Maimonides takes criticism with, again following this idea of being against the anthropomorphic representation of God in any way, is the Shiur Koma, which is an ancient text, the measurement of the body. Literally it means the measurement of the body, which is an ancient text which is part of a larger literature that was transmitted through different periods of time and through different geographical locations. And allegedly, there's no particular time that it is ascribed to, but it comes from allegedly rabbinical times, and it's associated with Heichalot texts, the Heichalot literature, or the palaces literature, which describe the palaces in heaven based on Ezekiel's vision. So based on the prophet Ezekiel's vision of the heavenly realm, when he, through a prophetic vision, sees the heavenly chariot and the four creatures that hold up the heavenly throne. So based on these speculations, which actually have a name in rabbinic literature, Maaseh Merkava, the works of the chariot. And this works of the chariot is a large topic, and it includes different kinds of literature that were promulgated usually in very limited circles, rabbinic circles, esoteric circles, throughout the ancient period, and in different ways they came through various communities, both in the Sephardic Iberian Peninsula, as well as they were communicated to the Hasidei Ashkenaz in the German Rhineland. So these texts, again, it's a vast literature, but one of the main themes that runs through this literature is the description of the heavenly realm. The heavenly realm, which is comprised of several heichalot, several palaces, and each palace is guarded by myriads of angelic beings. And as the sage ascends through the several palaces, by reciting various divine names and giving certain seals to these angels, because the angels are very protective of these various palaces, and they do not let human beings, even if they're sages, through very easily. You have to show your seal to them, and then you can move up to the next Heichal, or else you will be pushed into the river of fire. It's a very dangerous ascent, but if you do make it up, one of the final peak of this journey is to see the kavod, or the glory of God, which is seated on the throne, on the throne of Ezekiel. So these texts, the Heichalot text and the Shiur Koma, is part of this type of esoteric speculation. And the Shiur Koma focuses not so much on the angelic beings and not so much on describing these various palaces, but it focuses more on the kavod, on the created aspect of God's glory, and describing the measurements. And it's very strange for us to hear this, that in the heavenly realm, the created glory of God has various measurements, but it is something that these texts include and discuss in great detail. But this was one of those texts that Maimonides just could not stand. It did not fit with the philosophical view. In the philosophical view, God is completely immaterial. God is completely removed from the physical world. God cannot be described in physical attributes. God does not have attributes. God is immaterial and above the created realm, and cannot be limited in any kind of physical imaginary way, or any kind of physical description or limitation. So he really took a very critical stance on the Shiur Koma. But what is interesting, that he himself takes contradictory opinions on it. In one particular, and Alexander Altman, a great scholar, found the text in Moses Narbonne's epistle, where when he's talking about Moses Narbonne's epistle on the Shiur Koma, he discusses the fact that in fact Maimonides gave great kavod and great respect to the Shiur Koma in an earlier writing, and later on, at this time, everything exists in manuscripts. Everything that is written down is written down into manuscripts, and what that allows is you can easily cross out something that you do not agree with later on in your life. So what he finds is that the Shiur Koma reference that Maimonides makes in an earlier text is in fact crossed out in a later version of his text. So let us look at this a little bit more closely. It's an interesting example how the same thinker and rabbi changes his opinion even in his own life and his approach to a particular text. So he says the following. So this is Maimonides talking regarding different texts, midrashim and esoterical texts. The circle would have extended to include a discourse on the forms which the prophets mentioned in connection with the Creator and the angels. Into this, there enters the Shiur Koma and its subject matter. For a treatment of this subject alone, even if shortened to the utmost degree, 100 pages would be insufficient. So in this particular, it's Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah. Maimonides recognizes that this is an ancient text, a text that deserves great attention, and a text and a subject matter that would fill hundreds of pages. We go down a little bit later, and this is what and this is how he modifies his opinion regarding the Shiur Koma. So he goes 360 degrees, he turns 360 degrees around in order to espouse a very different opinion of this book. I never thought that it was one of the sages of blessed memory, and far be it from them that this book, that is the Shiur Koma, should have come from them. It is but a work of the Byzantine preachers and nothing else. Altogether, it's a great mitzvah to delete this book and to eradicate the mention of its subject matter and make no mention of the name of other gods, since he who has a body, Koma, undoubtedly is to be classed among other gods. In other words, later on in his life, Maimonides recognizes that in order to extol this text, he would have to compromise his principles, and there might be other people reading his work, and they will see that he extols the Shiur Koma and may derive wrong and perhaps even heretical opinions and heretical consequences and conclusions regarding this particular book, the Shiur Koma. So he changes his opinion and provides us with a very acerbic condemnation of the book as heretical. Just to summarize once again, philosophy, as it is included in the name philosophos, is the love of wisdom. And philosophers, one of the important things for philosophers was the pursuit of wisdom. And Jewish philosophers in the Middle Ages saw and regarded rabbinic classical text and the Bible, the text that came down to them, as ultimately containing eternal verities. But these verities have to be unearthed and pulled out with the methods of philosophical inquiry, rational and logical and allegorical process by which these texts can be properly interpreted and properly represented in a new cultural age, in a new cultural milieu. And again, one of the important things about philosophers and philosophy is not only do you have to cultivate your intellectual abilities, you also have to cultivate your moral and ethical qualities. And we have, for example, Isaac ibn Latif, who lived in the 13th century and who gives us a taxonomy, a list of 12 different attributes that he proposes should be cultivated by somebody who wants to attain human perfection and wants to be a philosopher prophet. And amongst the 12, he mentions physical perfection, courage, intellectual perception, superior memory, superior imagination, love of wisdom, excellence in persuasion, humility, rejection of bodily pleasures. We have encountered that before in Maimonides. Love of justice, the art of ruling. You have to be able to rule, and guiding other human beings to happiness. So it's not just an intellectual pursuit. You have to also cultivate these ethical, moral, human abilities in order to become a philosopher prophet. One last thing to mention about philosophy, and then we're moving on to Kabbalah, is to say that at this time, disputation was a very important way of contrasting and bringing into discussion different religions at this time. So one of the ways in which Christian authorities and the Christians, as well as in Muslim lands, they tried to bring Jews and proselytize Jews, was to force them. For example, in Christian Spain, in Barcelona, Jews were forced to sit in churches and hear and listen to sermons. Another way of forcing assimilation and proselytization was to bring Jewish communal leaders into discussion through public disputations, so you would stand at the public square, and there would be Nachmanides, for example. He was one of the ones who was put on such public disputation. Nachmanides would be standing there, and he would have to engage usually an apostate Jew, a Jew who converted to Christianity, who was knowledgeable about the classics of rabbinic literature, about the Bible, biblical interpretation, and so Nachmanides had to fare off against such a disputant. So in these disputations, and similar disputations were held at courts in Islamic lands, and in these disputations, the language, the universal language was philosophy. You had to defend your faith, not from within. You had to defend your faith through philosophical language, because that was the only way that you were able to, that was the only way for you to find points through which you could engage the Muslim religion, or you could engage the Christian religion. So philosophy provided those categories and those principles through which a religion could be properly defended. So in these lands, it was very important to master the philosophical language and the philosophical discourse and the philosophical works. Nachmanides, for example, in contradistinction to Maimonides, did not embrace philosophy to the same extent. Nonetheless, when he writes his commentary on the Torah, if you look at that, he includes philosophical arguments. He has to include Maimonides. He has to include Ibn Ezra. He disputes them and ultimately offers his own opinion and includes some Kabbalistic allusions in there as well. But he needs to be conversant with them, and he needs to include their opinions, because he knows that his readers will want that his readers will be cognizant. The Jewish readers, the rabbinic readers who will read his commentary on the Torah will be conversant with that kind of language. So he needed to have that language as well and include that in his commentary on the Torah. By contrast to philosophy, Kabbalah is a very different type of tradition. Kabbalah, the definition of Kabbalah is received tradition, and it refers to a body of esoteric or secret knowledge. Receiving and reception comprises a core or an essential component of Kabbalah. That is to say, in contradistinction to philosophy, which emphasizes the perfection of the human intellect as a precondition to acquiring knowledge about God or the natural world, Kabbalah dismisses the notion that divine knowledge can be accessed by rational inquiry. Rather, the Kabbalists emphasize the importance of transmission from a learned master to a student who was found to be worthy of receiving esoteric knowledge. Nachmanides elucidates this in the introduction to the commentary of in his commentary to the Torah, and he says the following. You have this on your sheet. And thus I attest with a faithful covenant based on reliable advice that anyone who looks into this book should not apply logic or reasoned thought to any of the allusions that I write concerning the secrets of Torah. For I will inform him with certainty that my words cannot be comprehended and nothing can be known at all by applying rational knowledge and understanding, except from the mouth of a wise Kabbalist into the ear of a capable and understanding receiver. Rational thoughts regarding these mysteries are folly, causing great damage and denying all profit. One should not trust spurious falsehood, for his rational intellect will produce nothing but evil. For they will speak rebelliously against God, for which they will not be able to atone. A very strong statement and position against the Maimonidean position, against the cultivation of rational intellect. So Nachmanides, what Nachmanides is saying here, when it comes to knowledge, to secret knowledge, to esoteric knowledge about God, there is no rational inquiry. You either hear it from a master, it comes down through the chain of tradition, going all the way back to the revelation of Torah at Sinai, because the Kabbalists maintain that the esoteric teachings of the Torah, exposition of the esoteric layers of the Torah came down from Sinai, from God, as he imparted and revealed the Torah to Moses at Sinai and the oral law. He also imparted the mystical teachings of the Torah to Moses, and so on and so forth. It came down through the chain of traditions, through Joshua, then the elders, then the Sanhedrin, the prophets. It came down to the receivers of the tradition all the way to Nachmanides. So Nachmanides maintains that unless you receive a proper teaching about a particular question, you cannot arrive at the teachings of Kabbalah on your own. You either receive it and then you have it, or you cannot. There were other models and other Kabbalists, such as Abraham Abulafia, who did not agree with Nachmanides and who cultivated a prophetic, ecstatic type of Kabbalah, where he felt that he was in possession of certain divine names and certain techniques through which he was able to bring about a prophetic consciousness and a prophetic experience, in which he was able to receive divine knowledge through the mediation of different angelic beings, but that was a very different Kabbalah than the one espoused by Nachmanides, which was a much more conservative Kabbalah, which defined Kabbalah as a received tradition, one that could not be accessed or inquired about through rational reasoning. In the 13th century, by and large, Kabbalah was taught and discussed and transmitted in elite circles. Generations of Kabbalists emphasized the importance of an authoritative master as the source of Kabbalistic knowledge, and called for regulating and restricting the dissemination of esoteric material. Kabbalistic textual activity therefore remained in the exclusive domain of elite families, who claimed to be direct recipients of an authoritative hidden tradition ontologically embedded in the revelation at Sinai. Kabbalistic dynasties in both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic intellectual milieu, such as the Kalonimides in the German Rhineland, Kalonimides, I always get that word wrong, Kalonimide, there it is, in the German Rhineland, and Rabbi Abraham ben David in Spain, followed the conservative, authority-centered mode of teaching based on the father or the master-son paradigm, which often delimited exegetical innovation and safeguarded against possible heretical and antinomian speculations. It was a very different environment than what we have today. Today, for example, I went on the website, on Google, and I punched in Zohar, and I got 1,610,000 entries. So we can access Kabbalah fairly easily today, even on the internet. I think Stanford University has a running text of the Zohar in its original Aramaic. But in the time, in the Middle Ages and later on in the early modern period, when Kabbalah and esoteric teachings, when they were written down in manuscript form, and they were circulated only amongst the students of a particular master. They were circulated in very limited circles. So we have someone like Rabbi Yehuda Hayat, who tells us in his introduction to Minhag Yehuda that he tried very hard and had to put up a lot of money in order to get various segments, various sections of the Zoharic literature, which he found in different places in Spain, and which he took with himself as he was leaving Spain during the expulsion. So it wasn't very easy to get to Kabbalistic manuscripts and Kabbalistic knowledge in the medieval period and later on in the early modern period. let me now move on to some of the differences and some of the similarities between some of the points of commonality between Kabbalistic literature and philosophical literature. And I will just touch on one aspect, which has to do with hiddenness, concealment, and esotericism. And here it's very interesting in this particular topic to see that both the Kabbalists as well as Maimonides state that there are several layers to understanding the Torah. And Maimonides says that as well as the Kabbalists, that the Torah has an external, literal, pashat level of meaning, but it also has an esoteric meaning. And there were Kabbalists in the Middle Ages, such as Abraham Abulafia, who says that in fact there are 7 different layers to understanding the Torah, and each one gives you a different understanding, a philosophical, a midrashic understanding. So he espouses seven different layers. So let's look at what Maimonides says in his Guide of the Perplexed about the different layers of the Torah, and that the hidden layers of the Torah have to be safeguarded from the vulgus, from the ordinary Jew who does not have the proper understanding of these esoteric secrets. He says the following: "It is not the purpose of this treatise to make its totality understandable to the vulgar or to the beginners in speculation, nor to teach those who have not engaged in any study other than the science of the law. I mean the legalistic study of the law, halakha. For my purpose is that the truths be glimpsed and then again be concealed, so as not to oppose the divine purpose which one cannot possibly oppose, and which has concealed from the vulgar among the people those truths especially requisite for his, that is God's, comprehension. You should not think that these great secrets are fully and completely known to anyone among us. They are not, but sometimes truth flashes out to us so as we think that it is they, and then matter and habit in their various forms conceal it, so that we find ourselves in an obscure night, almost as we were at first. We are like someone in a dark night over whom lightning flashes time and time again." To be sure, there were Kabbalists such as Rabbi Israel of Gerona and Rabbi Ezra, students of Rabbi Isaac the Blind, who lived in Provence in the 13th century, late 12th and 13th century, who contravened the ban of their master and engaged in open dissemination of esoteric teachings they received from Isaac the Blind. As a result, public debates ensued in synagogues and even marketplaces, elaborating on the nature of Kabbalistic mysteries, which elicited strong condemnation from the Kabbalistic elites. Rabbi Isaac gives us a testimony that highlights the tension between his own cautious and conservative approach to the disclosure and the more democratic tendencies espoused by his students to disclosure of Kabbalistic mysteries. "For I was filled with great concern when I saw scholars, men of understanding and Hasidim, engaging in long discourses and presuming in their books and letters to write about great and sublime matters of the Kabbalah. But what is written cannot be kept in the closet. Often these things are lost, or the owner dies and the writings fall into the hands of fools or scoffers, and the name of heaven is thus profaned. And this is in fact what happened to them. I am of an entirely different habit, that is, not to speak or write openly about Kabbalistic matters, since my fathers were indeed the most distinguished in the land and public matters of the Torah, but never did a word relating to the mystical lore escape their lips, and they conducted themselves with them, the uninitiated, as with people who were not versed in the higher wisdom. And I beheld their practice and learned my lesson. I have also heard that they openly hold forth on these matters in the marketplaces and in the streets, in confused and hasty discourses, and from their words it is clearly perceptible that their heart has been turned from the All-Highest, and they cause devastations of the plants, heresy, whereas these things are united as the flame is bound to the coal, for the Lord is unique and has no second by his side. And what can you count before the one? That is the great name, which is united in all the 10 Sephirot. But I cannot enter at any greater length in writing in what you have said. And another conceptualization that comes from the Hasidei Ashkenaz is a short saying that you have on your sheet. Do not speak so loudly, but in a whisper, because the glory of God is in hiding the thing. So again, the Hasidei Ashkenaz, Elazar of Worms, emphasizes the fact that secrets about God, secrets about the divine realm have to be kept, have to be transmitted in a whisper, and have to be kept hidden. I will come to sort of the last bit of my talk, and let me just. And I'd like to just bring together and offer you three different, I had to skip some sections, but let me just finally offer three different models in which describe and give us a sense of the relationship between Kabbalah on the one hand and philosophy on the other. There are three different categories in which and ways in which we can understand the relationship of Kabbalah and philosophy. On the one hand, the first position maintains that Kabbalah and philosophy are essentially the same. In other words, both Kabbalah and philosophy speak about the same eternal verities, but they use different language. So the only difference between Kabbalah and philosophy is the language. And this kind of position was espoused by Rabbi Azriel of Verona, a Kabbalist in Catalonia, and he supports his opinion the following way. The words of the wisdom of the Torah and the words of the philosophers, Balei HaMechkar, follow the same route, and there's no difference between them, but a difference in terminology. That is because the philosophers did not give the appropriate names to the various parts of reality. On the other hand, the sages of truth, the Kabbalists, who received their knowledge from the prophets, who in turn received from the mouth of God, know how to distinguish properly between different parts of reality and to name everything appropriately according to its potential and actual. In other words, Rabbi Azriel Jonah says, they talk about the same thing. The philosophers have the wrong terminology, the wrong dictionary. The Kabbalists have the right one, but essentially they propose and they embrace the same position. According to the second understanding of the relationship between Kabbalah and philosophy, these two different systems of thought are in a hierarchical order to one another. In other words, according to this position, philosophy is fine for describing and talking about the natural world. So you can use philosophical language, it's at a lower level, lower than Kabbalah. Therefore, when you talk about the lower world, such as the natural world, the physical world, the material world, you can use the terminology of philosophy and you can use philosophical speculation. But when you move on and you talk about the metaphysical realm, the divine realm, and about God, the right language is the Kabbalistic language, which represents a higher, a superior form of knowledge than philosophy. And this particular opinion is espoused by several proponents in the Middle Ages, and you will have that on your sheet. So please, if you'd like to look at it, take a look at it at home. I'm going to move on to the third category, which sees philosophy and Kabbalah essentially as irreconcilable speculative systems that are in binary opposition, so in complete opposition with one another. Thus, while Kabbalah is internal, reliable, and divine knowledge, philosophy is foreign, extraneous, and false, even demonic knowledge. And this type of, there's a very interesting quote from Isaac of Acre, who gives us the following statement regarding how he sees philosophy and Kabbalah. The fools among the philosophers who philosophize and depend on knowledge acquire through their own speculations. They are wise in their own eyes, yet they do not possess knowledge of the 10 Sephirot Blima, which are the names of the Holy One, blessed be He. Their belief is evil and deficient, because they consider as nothing the prayer and blessings, and they act negligently in regard to all the commandments. So in his particular view, the philosophers are aggrandize themselves in their own eyes. They see wisdom as the ultimate, the cultivation of the intellectual faculty, of knowledge as the penultimate goal of the human being and of the Jew. But at the same time, often they neglect to follow the mitzvot, the commandments, that is so important and such an important part of Judaism. There's one other view that I want to introduce to you, and that sees the philosophers as borrowing ideas from the Jews, going back to Plato. This is articulated by a 16th century philosopher, Rabbi Joseph Del Medico, who says the following: Plato's views are almost those of the sages of Israel, and on some issues it seems as if he, Plato, had spoken without any blemish on his lips, using the mouth of the Kabbalists and their language. And why shall we not hold these views, these philosophical tenets, since they are ours and were inherited by the Greeks from our ancestors? And with that, I will close. Thank you very much.
Moderate the questions. I'm just going to turn this off.
I'll perhaps start